Okay, everybody join me in welcoming Vi La Bianca.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for letting me crash your service today. I am so excited to see an atheist church existing and thriving, especially now with COVID and everybody feeling so isolated and really in need of that human connection. I know some atheists might not like the idea of an atheist church, but I've always found it to be a really interesting and exciting idea to be able to have that community and that kind of support and appreciation for each other in that structure ourselves. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, everybody, for organizing this and for inviting me. If you don't know who I am an atheist activist and content creator. I work with the atheist community of Austin down here in Texas. I co-host 2 shows with them, Talk Heathen every Sunday, which on a normal Sunday I would be doing now, but I took the day off to be here with you. And then I also co-host Secular Sexuality on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Central. Also have my own channel where I do live streams every Thursday and put out my own videos called How to Skeptic, which talk very much about good internet hygiene and how to do good research using my background as a journalist. And the reason I'm here today is to kind of draw mostly from my experience and my passion from secular sexuality. So there is a lot that we talk about today that we don't realize is impacted by a religious culture. So even if we have left that religion, we often find ourselves in a position of being impacted by that, either unconsciously. And I think today I just want to unpack that a little bit, specifically around the concept of gender. So this conversation is going to be about why atheists should care about gender. And I want to start out by sharing my coming out story as an atheist. So when I came out as an atheist, it was after a long process of research and soul searching, for lack of a better term. Being different in that way had never even been presented as an option, and God knows there was not enough representation in the media I consumed. And when there was a character like me, generally they were either a caricature or a stereotype or full of misinformation and assumptions from the outside. So it was very difficult for me to even find the word that described me. And when I finally did, it kind of clicked, right? There was that shock, there was that relief. There were other people like me, and there was a word that encompassed, if not perfectly, at least the experience that I had. And you know how it goes, right? After finding the language, you're better able to research and find community. And that's one of the reasons why language is so often heavily policed by the dominant culture. Without the right words, you can't find the right information, and information is. I came out to some friends from my Christian undergrad, and I was shocked that many of them had also felt the same way that I did, had been wrestling with that same doubt and feeling really isolated from everybody because either they didn't have the words or they were too afraid to voice them because of social stigma. And once we voiced those words together, we grew closer. Others, unfortunately, grew farther away. When I told my family I was an atheist, I didn't know if I would be shunned forever or accepted for what I was. It turns out they had suspected for a while I wasn't nearly as subtle as I thought I was. And while I wasn't shunned, which makes me one of the lucky ones, I did see a switch in how they approached me, right? Conversation topics would turn awkwardly to faith more explicitly than before. Prayers and Bibles and tracts were shunted a little bit more desperately in my direction. And there was just enough distance to allow them plausible deniability with their God and their community. So here's the thing, I know it's painful for them, right? They raised me to be a good Christian. To see me not only leave the fold, but become publicly known for my atheism must evoke some very deep discomfort. But as we all know, discomfort is not a bad thing. Discomfort is important to growth, learning new things, and accepting that we didn't know it all to begin with. So hopefully that brief coming out story was relatable to some of you. Some of you may even know where I'm going with this. Every single part of that story is also applicable to my journey coming out as a trans non-binary person. So if you don't know, I am trans non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. And the experience of coming out that way came several years after coming out as an atheist, and it felt almost identical. There are very many parallels between coming out as an atheist and coming out as trans. There's the realization, often after years of experiencing a deep-seated and unnamed discomfort with the status quo. How things are don't quite fit with who you are. There's the coming out process, which can happen in an instant or be dragged on for years. There's the lack of nuanced representation in mainstream media, the small but supportive communities, and the fear of losing everything, your job, your financial security, your loved ones, if they discover who you truly are. And perhaps most importantly, there's the process of becoming a new person, whether that's as simple as a shift in mindset or as challenging as a life rebuilt from the ground up. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about how gender intersects with atheism and how addressing the two simultaneously is fundamental to a full deconstruction of the Christian worldview. So by the end of this talk, I might not have you believing in 72 genders, and you'd be right, no one actually thinks that, but I do hope to flesh out a few things. First, that we are trained to view things like gender deeply, the way we are trained to do this is deeply embedded in our culture's religious background. Second, that addressing religion without addressing other social issues held dear to the church leaves us stranded in the middle of an incomplete deconversion. And third and finally, that by learning and combining forces with gender, romantic, and sexual minorities, or GRSM for short, that's a term that I'll be using today, we can create a stronger and louder movement with which to fight back the dominance of Christian nationalism in this country. So first, let's talk about how Christianity has shaped our understanding of gender. First thing I want to point out is that gender as it's understood today and spoken of in GRSM communities is not mentioned in the Bible, not once. And this usually gets me a lot of weird looks from theists and atheists alike. And there were certainly gender roles discussed and very strictly enforced, even though the term gender roles wouldn't be coined until 1954. And, let's back up for a minute. Perhaps the best place to start is to define this term in the first place, right? What is gender, especially as used in the social sciences and in medicine? There seems to be a lot of confusion here, and history and pragmatics both justify it to an extent. But let's see if we can unknot this a little bit. So there's this idea that sex was the term for biological reproductive capacity in Greek, and gender was the term in Latin. But that's actually incorrect. And I only recently discovered this, and I'm very excited because turns out both words are Latin, sexus and genus. Sexus meant gonads, and genus just meant kind, sort, or class of person. You might know it by its 12th century French cousin, genre, as in, what's your favorite genre of fiction? Which raises an interesting question. So if you were a genre instead of a gender, what genre would you be? My partner says he'd be suspense. He says, I'm mystery, but I think I'm probably more like one of those overly long absurdist plays. So that's a fun little thought experiment to do for yourself, just to do a little bit of that introspection. So here's the fun part. In the 20th century, sex started taking on those erotic overtones, and so polite society, as well as those who wanted to distinguish between biological sex and the action of having sex, appropriated the word gender to mean biological sex. That was around 70 years ago. So what's the sex of the baby became what's the gender of the baby, and no prudish parent blush, right? Everyone's happy. But today, many people, academics, scientists, the GRSM community, and their allies are attempting to reappropriate the word to mean what it originally did, a kind or genre of person, not necessarily tied to sex at all. We use the phrase gender identity to describe this, and gender identity is nowhere in the Bible. Rather, the idea of relational or social identity was based solely on how your body functioned in the reproductive process. The ancient Hebrews had very strict and brutal guidelines that dictated much more than we currently do based on biology. For example, Leviticus 12 says, someone who gave birth to a male child would be ceremonially, it's a hard word to say, ceremonially unclean for 7 days and would need to abstain from entering the temple for 33 days. Someone who gave birth to a female child would be ceremonially unclean for 14 days and need to abstain from entering the sanctuary for 66, so twice as long. So ignoring all the other weird stuff going on here, right? Childbirth being somehow ritually unclean, blood confusing God by being in the sanctuary but not part of a priest sacrifice. It highlights the way people used to segregate by sexual function, whether they were the parent or the child. And while the Hebrews were not by any means the first ancient culture to do this, they were uniquely regressive for their time period and developed their laws, their legends, and their theologies in blatant opposition to the more sex-friendly and egalitarian, or even sometimes matriarchal cultures surrounding them. Cultures in places such as Ethiopia, Libya, Sumer, Elam, Anatolia, and Greece, as well as Babylon, Egypt, and Canaan. Those three sound particularly familiar because they are often cast as the bad guys in the Christian mythology, right? Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, completely separate, different cultures were discovering social roles and gender in completely different ways. Native American and indigenous nations such as the Blackfoot, Lakota, and Navajo embraced non-binary gender long before colonization. There are the Hijras in India, the Muxe in Mexico, and the Bakla in the Philippines. New Zealand, Italy, Tonga, Samoa, Hawaii, Siberia, Peru, the Congo, Kenya, Madagascar, they all have language and references to gender nonconforming classes of people who often held revered or even privileged positions in their cultures. So why does the concept sound so foreign to us, even after we've left the religion that might call it a sin? Because we live in the society that was a product of the suppression of other cultures, and it has stymied our understanding of the world by calling it taboo. And we all know the basic timeline of how this was accomplished, right? By 395 CE, Christianity was the dominant religion in Rome. By the end of the 1500s, it was the great power across Europe and making its way to other continents under the guise of imperialism. In the 1600s, it came to the New World, and the rest is history. And along with the story of Jesus came a whole lot of social changes that were enforced, often brutally and coercively. And because I can't resist a good Star Trek reference, it helps to think of Christianity essentially as the Borg, right? The goal was assimilation with the intent to control and aggregate power. And it remains the goal of Christian nationalists today. One of the things that got lost in all of this was the idea of people as individuals separate from their sexual function and the concept of non-binary or fluid gender. So here's where we come to how gender and atheism are interconnected, at least for those of us who want to use our own worry about Christian overreach to positively impact the world around us. If you grew up in a country where an Abrahamic religion was predominant in your culture, your views on many things, including gender, have been shaped by that religion. To ignore this is to stop midway through your deconversion process and allow that religion to continue to impact your life in real ways. Does that mean you need to start questioning your gender? No. Although, as I say on secular sexuality, everyone should think about and play with their gender, even cis people. It's fun and healthy to do that kind of introspection, even if most don't end in transition or a change in identity. What it does mean is that in order to be a fully deconverted person, truly out of the grasp of religion's brainwashing and mental oppression, you have to look at other areas that might seem intuitively right or wrong to you and question where that intuition is coming from. And then you have to continue pursuing education and the best available data to cross-check your conclusions. And then you have to do it again. And look, I know it's an exhausting process, but that's what we commit to, right? That's what separates us from everyone else and keeps us from being pulled back in. And that's also how we get stronger. And here's what I mean by that. The fact that atheists and the GRSM community are both targets of social stigma, religious attempts at disenfranchisement and censorship, and huge amounts of misinformation should be enough to allow us to say to each other, I see you. You are me. Let's do this together. But it's not just the ethical thing to be a good neighbor, to hold your hand out to someone you see weathering the same storm. It's also smart. The book Victory by Linda Hirschman lays out the gay rights movement from the 1940s through to the passing of Prop 8 in 2008. Linda discusses how individually GRSM communities were getting decimated by police forces, anti-gay legislation, and a lack of basic human rights. This changed only when gay men joined forces with lesbian women, and then they joined forces with trans folk, and then they all came together under the banner of LGBTQ. When they were no longer individual groups and became a community, they found social support, financial resources, and perhaps most importantly, lobbying power. This power grew even more when they decided to join forces with the civil rights movement in the 60s. Two groups who shared similar struggles came together and fought the establishment. As I've said before, and you might remember this from a talk I gave for Atheist Day this last year, while Christianity is splintered into too many different groups to count now, they do know how to band together when it matters, right? They understand how to put aside their divisions of doctrine and work alongside those they think are going to hell for being unbaptized or for praying to Mary in order to assure their political and social power remain unchallenged. Until atheists can do that as well, we will forever be fighting an uphill battle. Fortunately, we have a ready ally who knows the struggles we're facing, the abandonment many of us have suffered, and the joy of finding your true self despite it all. They've fought uphill battles before, and they've won. The GRSM community has much to teach us, and atheists have so much to offer in return. What's more, we have a shared goal to survive as full and autonomous individuals in a world that says we are worth nothing. All that's left to say are the words, I see you, you are me, let's do this together. Thank you.